When an unassuming black man enters a luxurious restaurant, the waitstaff laugh and mock him, dismissing him as someone who doesn't belong. Little do they know, this man isn't just any customer, he owns the entire chain. What unfolds next leaves everyone in stunned silence, delivering a lesson they'll never forget. The Grand Orchid was not just any restaurant, it was the crown jewel of fine dining in the city. Known for its exquisite cuisine, stunning decor, and clientele of celebrities and social elites, it was a place where appearances mattered as much as the food. On any given evening, the restaurant brimmed with hushed conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft melody of a live pianist tucked in the corner. Tonight, among the well-dressed patrons filtering through the revolving doors, one man stood out. Dressed in a simple yet neat dark suit, James Carter entered the restaurant with an air of quiet confidence. His rich, dark complexion contrasted with the golden hues of the chandelier light. James wasn't flashy. There was no entourage or extravagant display. He carried himself with a calm authority, his kind eyes scanning the bustling room. As he approached the hostess stand, a young woman with a rehearsed smile greeted him. Her polite demeanor shifted slightly when her eyes met his. Though subtle, James caught the brief hesitation before she spoke. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her voice pleasant but noticeably formal. "Yes," James replied, his tone measured. "Under Carter." The hostess's fingers moved swiftly over the screen before her brow furrowed slightly. "Ah, yes, Mr. Carter, your reservation is here. Please follow me." James offered a small nod, adjusting his tie as he followed the hostess toward a table near the window. He didn't miss the way her posture stiffened slightly, nor the way she cast a glance toward the staff as they passed. Something unsaid hung in the air, but James chose to let it slide. For now. At the table he sat, unfurling the pristine white napkin and laying it across his lap. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of sorts, a reward for the long hours he'd spent finalizing an important deal. But as he glanced around the room, he noticed the curious stares, the murmurs behind covered mouths. It wasn't the first time he'd felt this undercurrent of unease in such spaces, and he doubted it would be the last. As James perused the menu, two waiters nearby exchanged looks. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair and a crisp white shirt, leaned toward his colleague and muttered, "What's he doing here? Doesn't exactly scream our typical crowd, does he?" The other waiter, a younger man with a nervous laugh, shrugged. "Maybe he's lost." James couldn't hear their words, but he noticed the glances, the chuckles that stopped abruptly when he looked their way. Setting the menu down, he waited for someone to approach and take his order. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The staff moved efficiently around the room, attending to other tables, refilling glasses, taking orders, but not his. Finally, James raised his hand slightly to catch the attention of a passing waiter. The man hesitated, but approached with a forced smile. "Can I help you, sir?" the waiter asked, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "Yes," James replied, maintaining his composure. "I'd like to place my order. Is there someone assigned to this table?" The waiter glanced at the empty notepad in his hand, his smile faltering. "I'll get someone to assist you right away," he said before turning quickly and disappearing into the kitchen. James sighed, leaning back in his chair. The pianist's melody seemed to mock the tension building at his table. It was clear that his presence here was causing a ripple, and not the kind he intended. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the two waiters from earlier huddled together, their hushed voices betraying their disdain. "Seriously, why's he even here?" the taller waiter sneered. "This isn't the kind of place you just stroll into uninvited." The younger one shifted uncomfortably. "Should we just serve him and get it over with?" "Not a chance," the taller one replied. "Let him sit there. He'll get the hint." Back at the table, James patiently folded his hands. He could have made a scene, could have demanded service or called for the manager. But that wasn't his style. He was a man who believed in letting people reveal their true colors, because only then could they learn the lessons they most needed. And tonight, the staff at the Grand Orchid were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. The quiet tension in the room began to thrum louder as James remained seated, his patience unwavering despite the obvious disregard. While other patrons enjoyed the flawless service the Grand Orchid was known for, James sat at his table alone, observing, waiting. He wasn't angry, yet. He was, however, keenly aware that his presence was unsettling to some, and he had a strong suspicion why. The two waiters continued their charade, avoiding his table at all costs. One of them, emboldened by the taller waiter's dismissive attitude, muttered, "Maybe he'll just leave. Would save us the trouble." But James didn't leave. Instead, he flagged down a hostess walking past, her arms laden with wine glasses. She hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain, but eventually approached his table. "Excuse me," James said, his tone firm but polite. "I've been waiting for over 20 minutes. Could you kindly send someone to take my order?" The hostess nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Of course, sir. I'll notify your waiter immediately." As she hurried away, James leaned back in his chair, glancing out the window at the bustling city street. He could sense the stares of the waitstaff lingering on him, feel the weight of their judgment pressing down. But what they didn't know was that James Carter had spent his entire life walking into rooms where people thought he didn't belong, and walking out having proved them wrong. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the tension among the staff was palpable. The taller waiter, now emboldened by his own arrogance, decided to confront the situation head-on. "I'll handle him," he said, adjusting his tie as though preparing for battle. "Let's see how long he sticks around after this." Striding out to the dining room, he approached James's table, a thin veneer of professionalism masking his true feelings. The other staff watched from a distance, some curious, others visibly uneasy. "Good evening, sir," the waiter said, his voice strained with false politeness. "I apologize for the delay. We've been quite busy tonight." James met the man's gaze with an unflinching calm. "I appreciate that," he replied evenly. "I'd like to place my order now." The waiter smirked, his professionalism slipping. "Of course, but you should know we have a dress code here. While your attire is acceptable, it's not exactly in line with the standards we uphold at the Grand Orchid." James arched a brow, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Is that so? I wasn't aware my suit didn't meet your standards. Perhaps you'd like to elaborate." The waiter hesitated, realizing he'd miscalculated. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "It's just that we cater to a certain clientele, sir. Most of our patrons are familiar with our expectations." The underlying implication hung in the air like a heavy fog. Nearby diners paused their conversations, their curiosity piqued by the growing tension. James's smile widened, though his eyes grew colder. "I see. Well, let me assure you I'm more than familiar with the standards of this establishment. In fact, I think I know them better than you do." The waiter faltered, but before he could respond, the restaurant manager appeared. A tall, impeccably dressed man with an air of authority, he swept into the scene, his sharp gaze taking in the waiter, James, and the now watchful patrons. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his voice calm but commanding. James didn't flinch. "Not at all. I was just trying to place my order, but it seems there's been some confusion about whether or not I belong here." The manager's expression tightened as he turned to the waiter. "Is that true?" the waiter stammered, his confidence evaporating under the manager's scrutiny. I was just clarifying the dress code, sir." The manager's eyes narrowed. "The dress code, I see. And do you typically enforce it selectively, or only when you feel like it?" The waiter's face flushed red, his composure crumbling. James watched the exchange silently, his calm exterior masking the simmering anger beneath. He wasn't here to embarrass anyone, but he also wasn't about to let this slide. "Sir," the manager said, turning to James with a respectful nod, "please accept my sincerest apologies for this unacceptable behavior. I assure you this is not how we treat our guests." James's eyes flicked to the waiter, then back to the manager. "I appreciate your apology," he said, "but perhaps it's time you and your staff learned who you're speaking to." The manager's brow furrowed in confusion, while the waitstaff exchanged uneasy glances. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. Inside was a single document, embossed with the logo of the Grand Orchid. With deliberate precision, he opened it and slid it across the table toward the manager. "I'd like you to take a look at this," he said, his voice steady but charged with authority. The manager picked up the document, his eyes scanning the page. As realization dawned, his face paled. He looked up at James, his mouth opening and closing as if struggling to find the words. This can't be," he stammered. "Oh, but it is," James replied, his smile returning. "Shall I explain?" The staff and patrons leaned in, their curiosity reaching a boiling point. James Carter wasn't just a guest at the Grand Orchid, he was its owner, and what he was about to reveal would change everything. The manager stood frozen, the weight of the revelation evident in his expression. His hands trembled as he carefully placed the document back on the table, trying to maintain composure. The waitstaff, previously smug and dismissive, now exchanged nervous glances, their confidence evaporating like mist in the morning sun. James leaned forward slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Allow me to make things clear," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly who he was. "This document shows my ownership stake in the Grand Orchid. I'm not just a guest here, I own this establishment." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Nearby patrons whispered among themselves, their curiosity turning to disbelief. The same man who had been treated as an outsider, who had been dismissed and judged, was in fact the very reason the restaurant even existed. The waiter who had confronted James visibly paled. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a stammering attempt at damage control. I didn't know, sir. I didn't mean any disrespect." James fixed him with a steady gaze, his calm unnerving. "Didn't you?" he asked pointedly. "Or was it easier to assume I didn't belong here because of the color of my skin, because I wasn't dressed like the other patrons? Tell me, when you made that assumption, what gave you the right to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't?" The waiter flinched, his gaze dropping to the floor. He had no answer. James turned his attention to the manager, who was still struggling to process what had just unfolded. "You said this behavior isn't reflective of your standards," James said. "But I have to ask, how could it happen at all? How could your staff feel empowered to treat anyone, let alone one of your most important guests, with such blatant disrespect?" The manager cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Mr. Carter, I can't express how deeply sorry I am. This behavior is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for failing to ensure my team upholds the values we claim to represent." James nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough," he said. "This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is ever made to feel unwelcome in this space. The Grand Orchid is supposed to be a place of excellence, a beacon of hospitality and respect. If your team can't embody those principles, then perhaps you need a new team." The manager's face fell, and the gravity of James's words settled heavily over the room. The waitstaff, now thoroughly chastened, stood silently, their earlier arrogance replaced by visible remorse. James rose from his seat, standing tall and commanding. The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath, captivated by his presence. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I expect every member of this staff to undergo comprehensive training. Training that covers not just hospitality, but respect, empathy, and diversity. And I'll be personally overseeing the process." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This isn't just about punishment. It's about growth. We can't change the past, but we can ensure the future reflects the values we claim to uphold." The manager nodded quickly, his earlier confidence replaced by humility. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Whatever you deem necessary, we'll implement it immediately." James's expression softened slightly, though his authority remained. "Good," he said. "And as for these two waiters—" He turned his gaze to the pair who had treated him so poorly. "They have a choice. They can learn from this or they can find employment elsewhere. The decision is theirs." The two waiters nodded fervently, their faces a mixture of shame and relief. "We'll do better," one of them managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Satisfied, James glanced around the room one final time. The tension had shifted, replaced by an air of accountability and change. Patrons who had watched the entire confrontation unfold now looked at James with admiration and respect. "I'll be back," James said, his voice steady. "And when I return, I expect to see a staff and a culture that truly reflects what this restaurant is meant to be." With that, he gathered his belongings and strode out of the restaurant, his presence leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the moment. The Grand Orchid was never the same after that day. James Carter's words echoed not just within the restaurant's walls, but throughout the entire hospitality community in the city. News of the incident spread quickly, with patrons sharing their experiences on social media, painting James as a symbol of dignity and justice. The restaurant's manager wasted no time implementing the changes James had demanded. Within a week, a comprehensive training program was developed and rolled out to every staff member. The sessions, led by diversity and inclusion experts, were not just about hospitality, but about confronting biases, fostering empathy, and ensuring equality. The waitstaff who had humiliated James sat through the sessions with solemn faces, their earlier bravado replaced by genuine self-reflection. James made it a point to check in regularly. His visits were unannounced, ensuring that the changes were authentic and not just performative. Each time he walked through the restaurant's doors, the staff greeted him with respect, not out of fear, but out of an acknowledgement of the values he had instilled in them. One such visit became a defining moment. James walked into the restaurant and was greeted by one of the waiters who had once tried to humiliate him. The young man, visibly nervous but resolute, approached James with a look of determination. "Mr. Carter," the waiter began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I owe you an apology, not just for how I treated you that day, but for how I viewed people in the past. The training sessions opened my eyes to the prejudices I didn't even realize I had. I can't change what I did, but I'm committed to being better." James studied the young man for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step," he said. "But growth comes from action. Show me that you've changed, not just in how you treat me, but in how you treat everyone." The waiter nodded, his posture straightening with newfound resolve. "I will, sir." Word of the Grand Orchid's transformation reached far and wide. Customers returned in droves, not just for the exquisite dining experience, but because they admired the restaurant's commitment to change. The once exclusive establishment became a beacon of inclusivity, attracting patrons from all walks of life. James's influence didn't stop there. Inspired by his actions, other businesses began to examine their own practices, implementing similar training programs and pledging to create welcoming environments. The ripple effect of that one confrontation was undeniable, sparking conversations about equity and respect across the city. Months later, James found himself back at the Grand Orchid, this time for a special event organized in his honor. The restaurant, now a symbol of transformation, had decided to dedicate an evening to celebrating diversity and inclusion. Guests from various backgrounds filled the elegant dining room, their conversations a testament to the unity that had been fostered. The manager approached James with a smile. "Mr. Carter, we couldn't have done this without you," he said. "Your courage forced us to confront our flaws and grow. I can't thank you enough." James shook his head. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about what this place stands for now. It's about the people who walk through these doors feeling valued, no matter who they are." As the evening progressed, James was invited to speak. He stood at the front of the room, looking out at the diverse crowd before him. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he began, his voice steady and heartfelt. "It takes effort, humility, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But when we commit to those changes, we create spaces where everyone belongs. That's the legacy we leave behind, not just for ourselves, but for future generations." The room erupted in applause, the sound a testament to the impact of his words. For James, the journey had been about more than just one incident. It was about proving that dignity and justice could triumph over ignorance and prejudice. As he left the restaurant that night, James felt a sense of peace. The Grand Orchid was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose to stand up, speak out, and demand better. And for James, that was the true mark of success.